Normally with families, the first generation makes the money, and then the second generation kind of keeps the business going, and then the third generation loses it. But the second generation in this case was a bloke called Oscar Benno Pedro Seppelt, who took over the father's business in 1868. He was a really eccentric character. He used to walk around with an umbrella over the top of his head. If you look at the photographs of him, he's always kind of suited. He looks like this kind of colonial master, a complete eccentric. He used to design his own clothes, and he was somebody who was very much a patriarch and really believed that he should be looking after his workers. And everything that he did was in the image of doing something that was purposeful and meaningful, not only for the Seppelt family, but for the local community. You are listening to Andrew Caillard, and this podcast is about Seppeltsfield's 1888 Gravity Cellar, one of the most remarkable pieces of 19th century winery architecture in the world. The Seppeltsfield 1888 Gravity Cellar was built in response to a building market for Australian fine wine overseas. The devastation of phylloxera in Europe almost threatened Australia itself because it was discovered in 1875. But visionaries in the South Australian government legislated against vine stock material coming into South Australia and protected the wine industry from this dreaded pest. And even today, phylloxera has not arrived in South Australia. And one of the great beneficiaries of this legislation and for an increasing export market was the Seppelt family. Seppeltsfield was established in 1851 by Joseph Seppelt, who was a visionary and who was involved in the tobacco industry back in Europe. And his initial plan was to become a tobacco planter in the Barossa. But he discovered really that tobacco wouldn't really work very well in South Australia, so he landed up becoming a vigneron. The Seppeltsfield business flourished during the late 1800s. And so in 1888, Benno Seppelt designed the most modern gravity flow winery in the history of the world of wine. The Gravity Flow winery, the purpose of it really was to enable wine to be made without the interruption of failing machinery. And in fact, gravity allows the wine to retain its kind of character. If you put wine through a pump, for instance, it can strip out the flavors. And so gravity works in many different ways. But essentially, the reason why they did it is because it's a much more efficient and cheaper way to make wine, because you don't really have a huge amount of equipment that can fail. In the late 1800s, steam power was relatively common in South Australia, and Seppeltsfield was the largest winery in South Australia and one of the largest wineries in the world. And so a lot of its equipment had been previously operated by steam engines that would operate things like presses, continuous presses, and all of that kind of stuff. And although Seppeltsfield were using that type of machinery, they didn't need to use it in this particular building. The building was created on the side of a terrace, and it's still there today. And it looks exactly the same as it was when it was built. And there are photographs of horses and drays delivering grapes to the wineries. At that time, Seppeltsfield only grew about a third of its crop. Most of the fruit that it processed was bought from the local community, and they would arrive. The fruit would be weighed on a weighing machine, and then it would be transferred into the winery, and then the wine would be fermented in these very, very large, open, concrete vats, and then would be drained by gravity, then go into barrel, and would then be matured. One of the things that also happened during this particular time was that Seppeltsfield started to get involved in making fortified wine. And in 1878, Benno Seppelt decided that he was going to make a fortified wine that would be aged in barrel for 100 years before it was released. Now, this is a completely eccentric thing to do. There are very few people in the world who would ever think of putting something into a barrel for 100 years and that the wine should not be even tasted by the public for 100 years. This is something that just doesn't really happen. But this was Benno Seppelt, and he was an extraordinary eccentric and an extraordinary visionary. And it wasn't really just about those 100-year-old ports. It was actually about creating something that was meaningful and purposeful and that would last for generations. In many respects, Seppeltsfield is like a grand 19th century folly. You know, everything that's there is totally and utterly eccentric. And that includes the Canary Island date palms that line all the roads leading up to Seppeltsfield. When you arrive, you think you're in a completely different world. Away from the classic Barossa Deutsche, you think you're in some tropical island of some sort. And it really is quite remarkable. So it takes another eccentric like Warren Randall, who, funnily enough, kind of looks a bit like Benno Seppelt himself. Well, not that he looks like them, but probably has the same type of swagger. I can't imagine him with an umbrella above his head. But he's certainly somebody who has a remarkable vision and has a remarkable optimism about the future. You know, the future is not something to fear, it's something to grasp. You know, when I visited it shortly after he'd commissioned all the fermentation tanks to be lined with stainless steel, which is a massively big project and requires an enormous amount of craftsmanship and skill to do, you know, it completely blew me away. And I think that, you know, what he's done is he's really kind of enabled this remarkable winery, first commissioned in 1888, to continue working as a winery for another 100 years. So the Seppeltsfield Gravity Cellar is not just about the technology that's deployed today and before. It actually represents something a lot more than that, because it's all about vision. It's all about creating something that is meaningful and that is lasting. And you realize that Seppeltsfield is something really, really special in the history of Australian wine. For more information on the remarkable 19th century 1888 Gravity Cellar, visit seppeltsfield.com.au. This podcast was read by Andrew Caillard, sound designed by Declan Diacono at Clang Studios, music by James Greville, and produced by Christoph Priddle.